Amara had always believed in the simple goodness of lending a hand when someone needed it. A 27-year-old single mother, she lived in a tiny apartment on the edge of town with her 6-year-old daughter, Layla. Life wasn't easy. Between her part-time job at a diner and her evening classes and social work, Amara barely made ends meet. Despite her struggles, she carried a light within her, a quiet determination and an unfailing kindness that she extended to everyone she met. It was a gray Wednesday afternoon when she first saw him. Amara had just picked up Layla from school and decided to make a quick stop at the grocery store. The parking lot was bustling, but her attention was drawn to an elderly man struggling with several overstuffed grocery bags. His thin frame bent awkwardly as he tried to balance the bags and a cane, his face flushed with exertion. "Mommy, that man looks like he needs help," Layla said, tugging on Amara's sleeve. Amara nodded. "You're right, sweetheart. Stay here for a second, okay?" She walked over, her sneakers crunching against the asphalt. "Sir, can I help you with those?" she asked gently. The man looked up, his pale blue eyes wary at first, then softening. "Oh no, I couldn't trouble you," he said, his voice shaky but kind. "It's no trouble at all," Amara said, already taking a few bags from his hands. "Where's your car?" The man hesitated, then pointed to a weathered old sedan parked near the far edge of the lot. Together they walked slowly, his steps cautious and hers patient. When they reached his car, she helped load the groceries into the trunk and closed it with a firm push. "Thank you, young lady," he said, leaning heavily on his cane. "People don't often stop to help these days." Amara smiled. "It's no problem, really. My name's Amara, by the way." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm Walter. It's nice to meet you, Amara." They chatted briefly before Amara returned to her daughter, but as Walter drove away, she found herself wondering about him. He had a kind face, though it was etched with lines of age and something else, perhaps loneliness. The following week, Amara saw Walter again. She was at the diner, wiping down tables after the breakfast rush, when he shuffled in. He wore the same old brown coat and carried the same cane. But this time, he had a small, grateful smile for her. "Morning, Walter," she said cheerfully as he took a seat by the window. "You remembered my name," he said, surprised. "Of course I did," Amara replied. "What can I get you?" He ordered a simple cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs, and as Amara served him, they struck up another conversation. Walter told her he lived alone in a small house not far from the grocery store. His wife had passed away years ago, and though he had children, they lived out of state and rarely visited. Amara shared a little about her life too, though she skimmed over the harder parts. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more often. Amara began to look out for Walter, both at the diner and around town. She noticed how his hands trembled when he held a cup, and how he winced as he walked. She started helping him without being asked, refilling his coffee, carrying his groceries, and even walking him to his car when the weather was icy. Walter, in turn, grew fond of her. He admired her unassuming kindness and the way she always seemed to carry herself with quiet strength, even when it was clear that her own life was far from easy. One day, as they sat together in the diner after the morning rush, Walter looked at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "You're a rare kind of person, Amara," he said. "Most people don't stop to notice others anymore, let alone help." Amara laughed softly. "I just do what I can. The world's hard enough as it is." Walter nodded, his expression unreadable. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed in the power of small kindnesses." Amara smiled, brushing off the compliment, but something about his words stayed with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Walter had once lived a very different life, though he never spoke much about his past. As she walked home that evening, Layla skipping beside her, Amara thought about how small acts of kindness had brought a new friend into her life. What she didn't know was that her simple decision to help Walter that day in the parking lot would soon change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Winter deepened, and with it came frosty mornings and early evenings. Amara's life remained a balancing act of long shifts, evening classes, and caring for Layla. Despite the challenges, she found warmth in her growing friendship with Walter. Their encounters became a small but meaningful part of her routine. On her days off, she often stopped by his house after dropping Layla off at school, bringing him fresh baked muffins or just sitting with him over a cup of tea. Walter's house was modest but well kept, with faded wallpaper and shelves lined with old books. Amara noticed the photographs scattered throughout the house, images of a younger Walter with his late wife, a pair of boys she assumed were his sons, and a few formal portraits taken at events she couldn't place. Walter rarely talked about them, but Amara could see how much they meant to him by the way he dusted the frames so meticulously. One frosty morning, Walter greeted her at the door with a cane in one hand and a sheepish expression. "Amara, I hate to ask, but could you give me a ride to the doctor today? My car's giving me trouble." "Of course," Amara said without hesitation. "Let me grab my coat." On the drive, Walter sat quietly for a moment before he spoke. "I don't know how you manage everything you do, Amara," he said. "Raising a daughter, working, and still finding time to help an old man like me." Amara glanced at him and smiled. "I don't see it that way. You're not just an old man, Walter. You're my friend." His expression softened, but he said nothing more. When they arrived at the doctor's office, Amara waited in the small, overheated lobby while Walter went in for his appointment. She used the time to work on her notes for class, but she couldn't help glancing at the door every few minutes, wondering if everything was okay. After what felt like hours, Walter emerged, moving a little slower than usual. Amara jumped up to meet him. "Everything all right?" she asked. Walter nodded but avoided her gaze. "Just the usual," he said vaguely. "Nothing to worry about." Amara didn't press him, but her instincts told her there was more to it. Still, she let it go for now, focusing instead on getting him home safely. Over the next few weeks, she noticed Walter seemed more tired than usual. He began leaning on his cane more heavily, and there were days when he didn't show up at the diner at all. One day, after her shift, Amara decided to check on him. She brought along a pot of soup she'd made earlier, hoping it would cheer him up. When Walter opened the door, his face lit up at the sight of her. "Well, if it isn't my favorite visitor," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I brought you some soup," she said, setting the pot down on his kitchen counter. "Thought you might need a warm meal." "You're too good to me," Walter said, shaking his head. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As they sat down to eat, Walter finally opened up. He told her he had arthritis, which made walking painful, and his eyesight was deteriorating. He'd also been feeling lonely lately, especially with the holidays approaching and no visits planned from his family. "I don't mean to complain," Walter said, his voice low. "I know everyone's busy with their own lives." Amara reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "You're not alone, Walter. I'm here and I care." Walter smiled faintly, his eyes misty. "You remind me so much of my wife," he said after a pause. "She had the same generous heart." Amara felt a pang of emotion at his words. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, yet Walter looked at her as if she had brought something precious back into his life. She resolved to check on him more often, especially as the weather grew colder. One snowy afternoon, Amara brought Layla along to visit Walter. The little girl's laughter filled the house as she told him about her day at school and showed him a drawing she'd made of a snowy forest. Walter seemed more alive than Amara had seen him in weeks, and by the time they left, his spirits were visibly lifted. "You've got quite the daughter there," Walter said as Amara helped him to the door. "She's a reflection of you, you know." Amara blushed but didn't argue. She simply waved goodbye, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. Helping Walter had become more than an act of kindness, it was now a part of her life. What she didn't know was that Walter was thinking about her just as much as she was thinking about him, and he had begun planning something that would one day change her life forever. The holidays approached, bringing a flurry of snow and a deeper chill in the air. Amara had always loved the season, even though it was a time of financial strain. Layla, wide-eyed with excitement, had written her letter to Santa, asking for simple things: a new coloring book, a warm scarf, and some extra crayons. Amara couldn't afford much, but she had saved just enough to make sure Layla's wishes came true. Walter, however, seemed quieter than usual. When Amara stopped by his house one afternoon with a plate of cookies she and Layla had baked, she found him sitting in his living room, staring at an old photograph. "Walter, are you all right?" she asked, setting the cookies down on the coffee table. He looked up, startled, and then managed a small smile. "Just remembering," he said, gesturing to the picture. It was of a much younger Walter, standing beside a tall Christmas tree with a woman and 2 young boys. "That was the last Christmas we all spent together," he said quietly. "Before the boys grew up and moved away. Before Margaret passed." Amara sat down across from him. "It looks like a beautiful memory," she said softly. "It was," Walter replied. "But memories can be a double-edged sword. They warm your heart, but they also remind you of what's gone." Amara didn't know what to say, so she simply reached out and squeezed his hand. "You've got us now," she said after a moment. "Layla and I, we're here for you." Walter looked at her with an expression of deep gratitude. "You've already given me more than you know, Amara." As Christmas drew nearer, Amara invited Walter to join her and Layla for their modest celebration. "It's just the 2 of us, so we'd love the company," she said brightly. Walter hesitated. "I don't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be," Amara insisted. "Besides, Layla's already excited about the idea of having you over. She wants to show you the Christmas decorations we made." Finally, Walter agreed. On Christmas Eve, he arrived at Amara's apartment with a carefully wrapped package in hand. Amara's home was small but cozy, filled with the smell of freshly baked gingerbread and the soft glow of string lights. Layla greeted Walter with a hug, pulling him inside to show him the paper snowflakes she had taped to the windows. They shared a simple dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables, and afterward, they exchanged small gifts. Walter handed Layla the wrapped package, and she opened it eagerly to reveal a beautiful set of colored pencils and a sketchbook. "These are perfect," Layla exclaimed, her face glowing with happiness. "Thank you, Mr. Walter." "You're very welcome, young lady," Walter said, his smile genuine. Amara had tears in her eyes as she watched the exchange. "That's so thoughtful, Walter, thank you." Later that evening, as they sat by the small artificial tree, Walter leaned back in his chair and sighed contentedly. "This is the best Christmas I've had in years," he said. "You 2 have brought more joy into my life than I thought possible." Amara smiled, though her heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine spending years feeling so isolated. "We're happy you're here, Walter," she said simply. Over the following weeks, their bond deepened. Amara continued helping Walter whenever he needed it, from driving him to appointments to running errands and even shoveling snow from his walkway on especially cold mornings. Walter, in turn, found ways to support her. He began slipping small envelopes of cash into her coat pocket when she wasn't looking, and though Amara always protested when she found them, Walter insisted it was the least he could do. "You've done so much for me, Amara," he said one day as she drove him to the pharmacy. "You've made me feel alive again. Please let me do this." Amara relented, though it made her feel a little uneasy. She didn't want Walter to feel obligated to repay her kindness. But what she didn't realize was that these gestures were only a small part of what Walter had in mind. One snowy afternoon, as Amara helped Walter organize his cluttered garage, she noticed a stack of dusty cardboard boxes in the corner. "What's all this?" she asked, brushing the dust off one of the lids. "Old files," Walter said with a shrug. "Stuff from a lifetime ago." Curious, Amara opened one of the boxes and found a collection of ledgers and documents. She couldn't make much sense of them, but one thing caught her eye: a photograph of Walter standing in front of a sleek office building, shaking hands with a group of sharply dressed men. You never told me you were a businessman, Amara said, holding up the picture. Walter chuckled softly. That was a long time ago, he said. I used to run a real estate firm. Amara looked at him with new curiosity. You must have been good at it. Walter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I did all right for myself, he said finally. But I've learned that success doesn't mean much without people to share it with. Amara nodded, not pressing further, but she couldn't help wondering about the life Walter had lived before she met him. Something told her there was more to his story than he was letting on. For now, though, she was content to let it unfold in its own time. What mattered most was the friendship. They had built, a bond that had brought light into both their lives during a season of snow and shadows. As the new year began, Amara's days grew busier, but she always made time for Walter. Their friendship had become a source of joy for both of them, and Walter seemed healthier and more vibrant with each passing week. He even started visiting the diner more often, sitting at his usual corner table and chatting with Amara whenever she had a spare moment. One afternoon, as Amara finished her shift, she was surprised to find Walter waiting outside the diner. His old sedan was parked nearby, but he was leaning on his cane, a look of determination on his face. Walter, what are you doing here? You should have come inside, Amara said, hurrying over to him. I was hoping you'd let me take you somewhere, Walter said. It's a bit of a surprise. Amara hesitated, glancing at her watch. Layla was at a friend's house for the afternoon, so she had some time. All right, she said with a smile, but only if you promise to let me drive. It's too icy for you to be out here on foot. Walter chuckled. Deal. He guided her to a part of town she rarely visited, a quiet, tree-lined street where the houses were larger and older, with sprawling yards and ornate fences. Walter instructed her to pull up in front of a stately brick home with tall windows and a wraparound porch. Whose house is this? Amara asked, cutting the engine. Walter smiled faintly. Mine. Or at least it used to be. Amara's eyes widened. This was your house? Walter nodded, his expression nostalgic. I bought it when I first got married. Margaret and I raised our boys here. It's been empty for years now, but I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Amara followed Walter up the steps, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. Inside, the house was cold but beautiful, with high ceilings and hardwood floors. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the air carried a faint scent of dust and time. Walter led her to the living room, where a grand fireplace stood beneath a mantel filled with framed photos. Why did you bring me here? Amara asked softly. Walter turned to her, his face serious. Because I want you to know the truth, Amara. About me. He gestured for her to sit, then settled into a chair across from her. I've been holding back because I didn't want to change the way you see me. But the fact is, I'm not just an old man with a bad leg. I've lived a very different life, one with more success than I ever needed. The truth is, I'm a millionaire. Amara blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. A millionaire, she repeated. Walter nodded. I built a real estate company from the ground up. It did well, better than I ever imagined. But after Margaret passed, and my boys moved away, none of it seemed to matter anymore. I let the company run itself and lived a quiet life. I didn't need the money. And I didn't want the attention. That's why I never told you. I didn't want you to think I was someone to be impressed by. Amara stared at him, trying to process the revelation. Walter, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Walter said gently. The reason I'm telling you now is because I've been thinking about all you've done for me, how you've treated me with kindness and respect. Even when you didn't know who I was. You've given me something money can't buy, Amara. And I want to give something back. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. This is for you. Amara hesitated. Walter, I can't. Please, he interrupted. It's not charity, it's a gift. And before you say no, Think about all the ways you could use it for Layla, for your education, for anything that makes your life a little easier. With a deep breath, Amara took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a check for $50,000. Her heart raced as she stared at the number, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Walter, this is too much," she said, her voice shaking. "It's nothing compared to what you've given me," Walter said firmly. "I've been blessed with more than I could ever spend in a lifetime. Let me share that blessing with you." Tears filled Amara's eyes as she looked at the man who had become such an important part of her life. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You've already thanked me," Walter said with a warm smile. "Every time you showed up, every time you cared. This is just my way of saying thank you in return." For the first time in a long time, Amara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She thought of all the ways the money could help, not just with bills and groceries, but with securing a better future for Layla. It was more than a gift, it was an opportunity to breathe a little easier, to dream a little bigger. As they left the house that day, Amara's mind buzzed with plans and possibilities. She glanced at Walter, who seemed lighter himself, as if sharing his secret had freed him from a burden. They didn't need words to express what they felt. Their friendship, built on kindness and trust, had brought them both a sense of purpose they hadn't known they were missing. The days following Walter's revelation were a whirlwind for Amara. The check sat in an envelope on her kitchen counter, a tangible reminder of the life-changing gift she had received. She stared at it often, her emotions swinging between gratitude and disbelief. Layla noticed her mother's distracted mood and asked one evening, "Mommy, is something wrong?" Amara smiled at her daughter and knelt down to her eye level. "No, sweetheart. In fact, something really good happened. Mr. Walter gave us a gift to help make things easier for us." Layla's face lit up. "Like magic? He's like a fairy godfather." Amara laughed softly. "Something like that. But he's still just Walter, our friend." Over the next few weeks, Amara found thoughtful ways to use the money. She paid off her overdue bills and bought warm winter clothes for herself and Layla. She signed Layla up for an art class at the local community center, where her love for drawing flourished. Amara also cut back her hours at the diner, giving herself more time to focus on her evening classes. She couldn't believe how much lighter life felt, how much brighter the future seemed. Walter, meanwhile, became even more of a fixture in their lives. He started joining Amara and Layla for Sunday dinners, where Layla proudly showed off her latest drawings and Walter shared stories of his younger days. Amara could see how much joy it brought him to be part of a family again, even if it wasn't his own. One Sunday evening, as they sat around the table, Walter cleared his throat. "Amara, there's something I'd like to talk to you about." She looked up from her plate, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course. What is it?" Walter leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next for me. I'm not getting any younger, and this old house of mine is more than I can handle. I've decided to sell it." Amara nodded slowly. She knew how much the house meant to him. "That's a big decision, Walter." "It is," he agreed. "But I've realized something. Holding on to the past isn't the way forward. What I want now is to make sure the people I care about are taken care of." Amara tilted her head, unsure of where he was going with this. "I've already started setting things in motion," Walter continued. "The proceeds from the sale will be put into a trust. Some of it will go to my sons and grandchildren, of course. But I want you and Layla to be part of it too." Amara froze. "Walter, you've already done so much for us. I can't accept." "Listen to me," Amara, Walter interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I've spent too many years with more money than I knew what to do with, and it brought me no happiness. But seeing you and Layla thrive, knowing I've been able to help, that brings me more joy than I've felt in decades. Please let me do this." Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she reached across the table and took his hand. "Walter, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You've changed our lives. And you've changed mine, Walter replied, his voice thick with emotion. You reminded me that there's still good in the world, still reasons to hope and connect. The months that followed were filled with new beginnings. Walter sold his house and moved into a cozy senior living community nearby, where he made fast friends and became something of a local legend for his generosity. Amara, with the financial stability he had given her, completed her social work degree and found a job helping struggling families navigate their own challenges. It was work that brought her immense fulfillment, knowing she was giving others the same hope Walter had given her. Layla, meanwhile, blossomed into a confident, creative child. Her art class became the highlight of her week, and her drawings grew more detailed and vibrant with each passing day. She often made pictures for Walter, who proudly displayed them in his new apartment. On a sunny spring afternoon, Amara, Layla, and Walter gathered for a picnic in the park. The trees were heavy with blossoms, and the air was filled with the sound of children playing. Walter leaned back on the bench, watching Layla chase a butterfly across the grass. She's going to do great things one day, he said, smiling. She already is, Amara replied, her voice full of pride. Walter turned to her, his expression soft. You are too, Amara. You've got a heart that changes lives. Never forget that. Amara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She knew that her life had taken a turn she never could have imagined the day she stopped to help Walter with his groceries. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a friendship that had transformed them both. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the park, Amara felt a deep sense of peace. She had struggled, yes, but those struggles had led her to this moment, a life filled with love, purpose, and the unshakable bond of friendship. It was a reminder that even the smallest gestures could set in motion the most extraordinary changes.